Lucius Cassius, governor of Asia 89 to 88 BCE. A scion of one of the more obscure branches of gens Cassia, Lucius Cassius had risen to the second highest annual office in Rome, just in time for the Social War, one of the Republic's most trying emergencies. However, he was assigned the governorship of Roman Asia and seems to have missed the conflict entirely. Normally, the governorship of Asia was the opportunity of a lifetime, with plenty of options for attaining glory and lining one's pocket. Whatever Cassius's intentions may have been, they were upended by renewed aggression from Mithridates VI of Pontus, who was attempting to seize the thrones of both Cappadocia and Bithynia, both of which were on the border of Roman Asia. In theory, Cassius should have played the leading role in trying to resolve this conflict, but his autonomy was taken away when a commission under Manius Aquillius arrived. Aquillius determined that Rome should draft allied forces in large numbers and punish the Pontic perfidy with extreme prejudice. When the Romans mustered nearly 180,000 men in the east, Cassius found himself at the head of 40,000, and he controlled his own axis of advance. Due to factors beyond his control, Cassius was unable to complete his mission, ultimately opting to disband his levies and flee to Rhodes rather than face certain defeat. When Aquillius and another army commander, Oppius, were captured, and Mithridates began his notorious massacre of Romans and Italians in Asia, Cassius and his staff represented the only Roman authority in the east. Helping the Rhodians to the best of his ability, Cassius was a part of the only Roman victory until the arrival of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who would liberate the overrun Roman lands, and finally end the First Mithridatic War. In the meantime, the best the Romans had was Lucius Cassius. The name Cassius was a proud one in Roman history. Gens Cassia dated back to the dawn of the Republic, with some of the patrician members of the family early on attaining the highest offices. However, over time, most of the patrician branches of the family died out, and only the plebeian branches were left. Of those, the most prominent and most noble plebeian branch was without a doubt the Cassius Longinus branch, which, of course, famously would produce one of the assassins from the Ides of March in 44 BCE. As far as where Lucius Cassius fits into all of this, he in all likelihood was from one of the many obscure cadet branches of the family. A number of men who were related to the family as a whole were able to rise to about the middle of the pack in the Senate, because even though they were not from the most prestigious line of gens Cassia, just being any part of it was enough to make someone a pretty viable senator, and someone who could fall just short of the consulship. A number of people have speculated that perhaps Lucius Cassius was the proconsular governor of Asia. The problem with that is that we have the consular fasti, which lists all the consuls in Roman history, and conspicuous by his absence is Lucius Cassius. He was not a consul, and so he must have been a pro-praetorian governor in all likelihood, which means that back in Rome he must have been praetor at some date before 89. It's even possible that he was praetor a few years before that and had been in the east for a long time, and that his command kept getting extended because of the Social War and Rome's reluctance to send someone out to replace him while they were all hands on deck to fight their allies. Now, it's also possible he actually was a proconsular governor, but he got that office without actually being consul. Once in a while, the Romans would give former praetors the title of proconsular governor just to give them more authority, but for the most part, they tried to avoid irregularities like that, so in all likelihood, Cassius was a pro-praetorian governor and ex-praetor. We're not really able to say a whole lot about Lucius Cassius's early career, given the obscurity of said early career. But we can talk about Roman Asia itself, the place where he would govern and ultimately make his name. This province had been created by the Roman Senate back around 133 BCE. That year, the last king of Pergamon, who had not had an heir, decided to will his kingdom to the Roman people and Senate. and they had then chosen to annex it as the province of Asia. It had also brought with it a lot of movable wealth, which had then been used by Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus to fund many of his programs. More importantly for our story, however, it was now created as the province of Asia, and in terms of the ancient regions it encompassed, if you're familiar with earlier periods of ancient history, this would encompass Ionia, Caria, Mysia, and a lot of what had once been the kingdom of Lydia. In terms of what lay outside of it, we of course have Bithynia to the north, Cappadocia to the east, and to the north and east would be the new kingdom of Pontus. The province of Asia had only been properly settled under the consulship of Manius Aquillius, who went out to Asia in person in 129 and defeated the last man to make a bid for the defunct Attalid crown, Aristonicus. So Manius Aquillius had settled the province. However, his deeds had not gone unnoticed. Not only did the Roman Senate still tend to look to Aquillius's son for guidance on what to do about Asia, but the people of Asia themselves still held a bit of a grudge against the elder Aquillius for his behavior. He had been notoriously rapacious and cruel, and in fact he had just narrowly avoided prosecution for his acts. Even the Romans thought he had gone a little too far. That being said, his notoriety in Rome itself had been forgotten over the last few decades because almost every Roman since then had decided that Roman Asia was best used as a cash register. A lot of the Roman governors who went out there had enriched themselves at the expense of the locals, and that meant that Roman rule was not altogether popular. Sure, there were plenty of people who were able to work with the Romans and make a good living, but plenty of them found that they were being oppressed as much or more than they ever had before. And again, most likely when Cassius arrived in Roman Asia, he was a pro-praetor, but it is not impossible that he was a proconsul given the wealth and importance of the province. We can say with some degree of certainty, however, that he never held the office of consul. So if he was a proconsular governor, it was by special appointment due to the importance of the province and perhaps the exigencies of the war they were fighting in Italy, where they wanted to make their governor in Asia look more powerful and important than perhaps he actually was. Lucius Cassius's fame owes to partaking in the First Mithridatic War. He was one of the first generals in that conflict, which would prove to be the first of three major conflicts between the Roman Republic and the King of Pontus. Mithridates was already an experienced ruler by the time that the First Mithridatic War took place. He had come to power back in 120 BCE when he was only 15, and after 20 or so years on the throne, he had managed to build Pontus up to its greatest extent ever. It now covered most of the shores of the Black Sea, and therefore had a lively commerce, a large population, and a good deal of grain production. So it had an economic backbone, it had a large population, it had a lot of the things you would need if you're trying to build an empire. And that's exactly what Mithridates wanted to do. In fact, we have a lot of evidence that he greatly admired Alexander the Great and saw himself in some way as being the next Alexander. Now, he also saw that the greatest threat to both himself and all of the other kingdoms that were either directly from the successors of Alexander or which had emerged because of Alexander, we'll just call them Hellenistic in the broadest sense, that the greatest threat to all of those states was the Romans. In fact, the Romans had humbled or reduced a number of those states while outright annexing others. Pergamon was one such example. He also knew that if he didn't take over the two weak kingdoms of Bithynia and Cappadocia, that at some point, probably within his lifetime, the weak kings who ruled there would willingly or perhaps be coerced into giving their lands over to the Romans directly. So his only chance of ever acquiring those lands was to take them before they became Roman. And so, he knew that Rome was his big obstacle. But how could he actually fight the Romans on favorable terms? They were simply too strong. Well, in 91, news arrived that must have seemed sent from the gods, because it turns out that Rome's allies in Italy were deeply discontent, and that discontent boiled over into a full-scale civil war known as the Social War, which would rage for the next 3 years. And with that war happening, the Romans were paralyzed. They could not send out armies from Italy to defend their provinces. And so he determined that this was the greatest moment that he would ever get, and that he needed to use this opportunity wisely. And so he decided it was time to take over Cappadocia and Bithynia. Then he could take those areas over, fortify and secure them, fend off any kind of Roman counterattack, and maybe, if he was being really ambitious, even overrun Roman Asia while he was at it, and then create a unifying identity for this group. Again, this was a man with bold intentions and grand ambitions. He saw himself as the Pontic Alexander. And so for him, this was a viable goal. And as we'll see, he came relatively close to pulling this off, at least at first. When Mithridates struck, neither Nicomedes IV of Bithynia nor his Cappadocian colleague were able to do anything about the Pontic invasion, and so they turned in desperation to the Romans. At this time, the Romans were not able to send aid directly from Italy, at least not in large numbers. However, they were able to send Manius Aquillius the Younger, who himself was a former consul and the son of the man who had once settled Asia. Another commissioner that gets named only once and apparently then faded from relevance was Manlius Maltinus. These two men and perhaps others arrived in Asia, and they determined that they needed to rally their local allies together and restore the two client kingdoms. Aquillius would quickly emerge as the driving force of this commission. Now, in theory, the commissioners were all equal, but in practice, he was the man in charge. And it's possible that someone like Manlius Maltinus actually just simply died when he got there, or something of that nature. But for the most part, because of his father's reputation in this part of the world, Aquillius seems to have felt that he was entitled to simply make decisions and get things done. He also seems to have been a rather overbearing and aggressive individual. And so because of his personality, his connections, and his seniority, he would effectively declare himself to be the Roman and allied commander-in-chief and launch an unauthorized war against Mithridates. Up to this point, Mithridates, while he had aggressed upon two nominal allies of Rome, he had not fought Rome directly. And given Rome's straitened circumstances, there were probably quite a few people back in Rome who didn't think it was wise to get entangled in a war, especially when they had no way to draft and send Romans to fight that war, at least not for the time being. In theory, before that legation arrived, as governor of Asia, Lucius Cassius would have been the man on the spot. He only had one legion there, and most likely, had it been up to him, without pressure from Rome, it's pretty unlikely that he would have tried to intervene at that moment. He would have realized that it would be a disaster to allow both kingdoms to fall to Mithridates, but at the same time, he simply did not have the troops to do anything about it. And while it might not have been apparent to Aquillius, Cassius does seem to have had a little bit better read of the morale of non-Romans, especially troops. And so he seems to have realized at a certain point that a lot of them would not fight very vigorously for the Roman cause. We'll come back to that later. There also was another legate who emerged named Quintus Oppius. He may very well have been another commissioner who simply wasn't named as such, but he will also become one of the big three. So the big three who emerge over time are Aquillius, Oppius, and Lucius Cassius. So those are the big three Roman figures of the war, at least in the early stages when Mithridates is winning everywhere all at once. The historian Appian heavily implies that Aquillius' decision to intervene on behalf of the Bithynians and Cappadocians was driven in large part by the fact that he had been heavily bribed by King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia. As a longtime client of Rome, Nicomedes perhaps knew that the Romans were in serious trouble in Italy, and also that nothing in Rome gets done without a good deal of bribery. And so he had made lavish financial promises to Aquillius and possibly others, including Cassius. But our source tends to focus mostly on Aquillius. The problem for Nicomedes is that when they did retake his capital city, it turns out that his treasury was empty. Obviously, the Pontic forces had looted it. And so, he couldn't pay off his debts immediately. So Aquillius, and perhaps the others, insisted that he go and get some damn money. After all, he should not be writing checks his broke ass can't cash. And so, dutifully, the Bithynian forces began to launch raids into Pontic territory. In the meantime, while that was going on, Aquillius ordered a mass mobilization of all of Rome's various allies. So Galatians, all of the other groups of the area were to come up in arms and then march out under the leadership of 4 different leaders, one of whom would be Nicomedes with the Bithynian army. He had somewhere around 50 to 60,000 men. And as for the 3 Roman commanders, Aquillius, Cassius, and Oppius, they would lead 3 armies of allies, each of 40,000 men, and each of them would take a different axis of advance. Aquillius himself would march directly into Bithynia, which was north of the Roman province, and then you could turn east and hit Pontus. Oppius would advance on the right side, so the eastern side. He would advance into Cappadocia. As for Cassius, he was to command the army in the middle. He most likely would advance up the middle in order to collect the Galatians who would be along the route. Now, because of his position in the center, that could mean that Cassius was supposed to be the pivot point. Perhaps he would function as reserve and reinforce either army if threatened. Or perhaps, while the other 2 armies were drawing attention away, he was intended to strike directly into Pontus itself. It's not entirely clear what was intended, and because the campaign will go so far astray so quickly, we'll never know. Another mystery of this campaign is who got what part of the 1 Roman legion that was actually there. Because all the accounts of the battles make it out as if all these battles are being fought entirely by native levies who were not too happy to be there. But there was a Roman legion. Most likely because it started with Cassius, it was still with him, but we really don't see it, and it's not really mentioned again. So its impact on this campaign turns out to be negligible at best. Aquillius's plan called for all 4 forces to march out at once, and so far as we know, all of them departed and were doing what they were supposed to. Nicomedes IV, with his large Bithynian army, was with Aquillius, so that meant that the western axis of advance into Bithynia had 100,000 or so men. This was a very strong army, and not surprisingly, Mithridates, when he was choosing which army to confront first, decided that he had to do something about that horde marching so close to Pontus. Now, going into this campaign, there were a couple more things that we need to note. One is that Nicomedes had been deeply unnerved by the reports from all the raiders he sent out to gather money. What had happened is that rather than having to fight local Pontic forces and gain booty the normal way by taking it through force, instead they found that all of the population centers they attacked were largely deserted and that none of the troops there put in an appearance. The civilians were also pre-warned and not there. And so this told Nicomedes that, 1, Mithridates had a plan, but also that the locals must have tattled, that there must be communication between his own people and the Pontic forces. And so, going into the campaign, Nicomedes' nerves were already shattered. He eventually would, of course, recover his nerves and be willing to ask Caesar out. That's a story for a different day. But for now, his nerves are spent. As for Mithridates, he did have a plan, and that plan involved seeking local sympathy. And the way that he could portray himself as the victim and portray the Romans as the aggressor was to allow his cities to be hit and then claim that the Bithynians were just the vicious lapdogs of the Romans, and that he would free them all from the evil of Rome, that he would emerge from his victimhood to become the great champion of freedom. And that propaganda, while very basic, was actually very effective, especially after 3 decades of Roman government, which had been mostly characterized by corruption and oppression. So as the 3 armies start to advance, Mithridates will directly confront Aquillius and Nicomedes near Mount Scoraba. And it is here that things will really start to fall apart, because it turns out that in the first skirmish, 100 of Mithridates' Sarmatians are able to rout 800 Bithynian horse, and of the routed 800, 300 are captured, and they immediately decide to join with Mithridates. Now Nicomedes, who is already shattered as a man, decides that his only course of action at this point is simply to leave immediately. So that night, he and his large army depart. And in the morning, Aquillian found himself completely abandoned, and with a large and very fired up Pontic army nearby holding the high ground. So this is off to an immensely horrible start. Sadly, we don't know whether Nicomedes directly informed Aquillian to his face about his decision. Later on, he gave us his official reason for departing so suddenly, that he had had a vision from the gods, that they had visited him in his dreams and given him premonitions of doom. And so, as a responsible ruler of Bithynia, he had no choice but to flee, for the good of his kingdom and for his Roman allies. That's all convenient, because the next day, when Aquillian woke up, he found himself down by over half his strength, and he determined that his only way to survive would be to fall back to a more favorable spot. And so he began the retreat, but he was quickly overtaken and overwhelmed by the Pontic army, which had a much larger and stronger cavalry arm. And so, of his 40,000 men, Aquillian lost 10,000, and then the rest more or less dissipated and deserted. So that was about a maximum defeat outside of something like Cannae, which requires that people actually stand and fight. But still, whatever fight had been in the anti-Mithridates people in Asia was taken out of them by that battle, with 10,000 casualties. As for Nicomedes, he arrived suddenly in Cassius's camp. And one imagines what Cassius was thinking when the king of Bithynia came to him all panicked and told him, yes, I have this large army, but also I chose not to use it, and I assume Aquillian will fight by himself. I don't know, man. So the two of them do decide to work together, so Cassius does not take it out on the cowardly king, and instead they themselves retreat to Caria, and they find a strong position called the Lion's Head, near the city of Nisa. And here the idea was to train their troops, because they realized the troops were not terribly well disciplined, and most of them were just fresh levies. Apparently Aquillian's plan had been predicated upon the assumption that Mithridates' troops were just levies who had no morale and no ability. So they had massively underestimated his abilities, and now their troops were dispirited as news arrived of what had happened to Aquillian. We also have to keep in mind that most of these men actually did hear about Mithridates' propaganda, and most of them were impressed by it. So some of them may have simply been underperforming on purpose because their hearts were Mithridates. And so, perhaps because they thought the men were disloyal, or perhaps because the drills weren't working fast enough and they knew that Mithridates was on the way, Cassius and Nicomedes decided together to disband their forces and fall back. And I do have to wonder whether Cassius by now knew that he absolutely had to keep monitoring this guy to make sure that he was on the up and up. And so maybe he kept him under guard in some way. I'd like to think he did, but there's no way to know. So, without a battle, the massive army of Nicomedes and the large army of Cassius are disbanded and never fight at all. So, talk about an anticlimactic way to go out. But if you can't trust your own troops, well, maybe it's not the dumbest decision in the world, but still, it's pretty embarrassing. During his short tenure at the Lion's Head, which was most likely only a couple of weeks, Cassius received some much-needed support from a local man who was quite prominent, and that was Cheiremen. So Cheiremen and his two adult sons provided a great deal of food and funding for Cassius's army. While things didn't work out at the Lion's Head, still it would have been a lot worse without Cheiremen's aid. Not to mention that on a personal level, I'm sure Cassius was relieved to receive some kind of local boost, to learn that there were some powerful people in the area who were still pro-Roman. And so out of gratitude, Cassius created a monument in order to thank his benefactor. So again, he is forced to disband his forces, or he chooses to avoid a battle when he hears that Mithridates is coming. And so Cassius and Nicomedes both disband their forces and began to flee. Cassius will make for the coast and make his way to Rhodes. In the meantime, though, when he is already well on his way past all of the famous monuments to Pluto that are in the city of Nyssa, this is when Mithridates will show up at the Lion's Head and then pursue hard to Nyssa, only to realize that he had already missed out. And Mithridates, as you might imagine, was frustrated that he had missed out on the chance to capture Cassius or Nicomedes. However, he did see this monument to Cheiremen. And by the way, the monument to Cheiremen has been located by archaeologists, so it is something that is still in existence. And this seems to have really set off Mithridates, because he learned that although his propaganda efforts had been effective to a certain degree, he still was having to deal with some locals who were pro-Roman. And there's a good chance that it was at this very moment when he saw that stone that he decided, okay, I'm going to have to sprinkle in a little fear when it comes to trying to get people to go against the Romans. For the time being, however, he will not initiate his massacre yet. Instead, his first response will be to put a heavy bounty on Cheiremen and his 2 sons. So for any one of them, if you capture that man alive, 40 talents. If you have to kill the man and bring in his body, it's still 20 talents. And 1 talent of silver, by the way, is a fortune. It's not enough to make you a local potentate, but it is enough to make sure that you will never have to work again or go without any luxury. So if you capture one of these guys alive and get 40 talents, you will be one of the great men of your area. And if you were somehow able to catch all 3 and keep them alive, then you would be very, very fabulously wealthy indeed. So this was quite a bounty, and it shows that Mithridates understood that if you really want to get things done, you need to make sure that the bounty is absolutely worth the effort. All 3 Roman commanders decided to take refuge with ostensible allies. Quintus Appius tried to make a new ally by reinforcing Laodicea with his remaining forces, only to be betrayed and handed over. As for Manius Aquillius, his fate was even worse. He went to Mytilene, which is on the island of Lesbos, only to be arrested by the locals and then shipped back over to the mainland and handed over to Mithridates in person. King Nicomedes IV, who had failed royally, and as we mentioned is a bit of a coward, decided to go all the way back to Rome. After all, he needed to get more help anyway, and why bother being around in Bithynia unless he had Romans there to back him up? Obviously, he couldn't cut it on his own. As for Lucius Cassius, he will come out of this looking relatively good, because he goes to Rhodes, which is the most loyal ally that the Romans have in this area. In fact, whereas all of their other allies, even ones who haven't been that badly abused, are now turning their backs on the Romans and going all in with Mithridates, the Rhodians, despite the general momentum, will choose to stand with Rome. They have a long, proud history of defending their capital city, and this goes all the way back to 305 when they decided to resist the siege efforts of Demetrius the Besieger. And they will survive that episode, and now they're quite confident in their abilities in a siege. And so once again, they determine that they must make a stand. However, it's worth mentioning that Rhodes was a democratic society, not everybody agreed, and some Rhodians will actually defect to Mithridates. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of the Rhodians, despite their determination to fight, probably did think that they were doomed. After all, up to this point, Mithridates had had a level of success unparalleled since the days of Alexander. And so there was a lot of fear and consternation within Rhodes. In fact, those deserters will go and meet with Mithridates while he's scouting the city and give him good advice on where to station his men. He actually will also find a height which overlooks the main capital, and this will give him his plan. So he leaves some men behind to have fire signals, and the plan is pretty simple. He has some men on land waiting with ladders to go attack the walls, and then he will also have a major assault on the harbor. And for that harbor assault, he has a siege weapon ready, which is a large ramp for men to run up. So the idea is simply to rush the walls of the city and overwhelm it rapidly through a surprise attack. Given Appian is not much of a military historian, we actually don't know whether the plan was for a dawn assault or whether Mithridates wanted to do a night assault. And in the event, whatever plan he had will be foiled by perhaps an accident or perhaps the deserters were double dealers. but let's see what actually happens when he decides to attack the city, which now includes, of course, Lucius Cassius, and potentially that Roman legion that we mentioned earlier. But again, we can't say that for certain. Back in the city of Rhodes itself, the defenders on the walls and on the towers saw suspicious movement outside, and they knew that this wasn't their forces, so they decided to light a fire in order to warn other people about the danger and to rouse the defenders. Well, it turns out that that movement was not the start of an assault, but it ended up being the start of an assault because of the fire. So the Pontic forces had been told to look for a fire, and now they saw one in the city. They also knew that there had been some deserters, so they interpreted that as, okay, we must attack now. But that ended up being a premature attack. So, on the one hand, the Pontic forces were well enough positioned that both the land and sea assaults took place. Most likely the timing got screwed up, though, because this went off earlier than expected. So, my suspicion is that the land assault happened first, and then the sea assault. But I don't really know for sure, and remember, Appian is not a military historian. Also, the Rhodians were ready, and that fire made them man their post and guard their city vigorously. Because the Rhodians were ready, Adrian Mayer has speculated that the Rhodian deserters were double agents. I don't think that's necessary as an explanation. Not only could you have plenty of legitimate deserters in any kind of ancient war where you have a city which has factions, but also fires are signals for every side. And that doesn't imply that the Rhodians who were in the city and loyal to the cause of the Romans were aware that the Pontic forces were about to use a fire signal to begin their assault. It's just fire signals are one of the few ways you can send signals at night reliably. So this was a case mostly of good luck on their part. The key moment in this battle came when Mithridates sent up his sambuca, which is a kind of boarding ramp that you mount between a couple of different ships and then have a large body of infantry rush up. So it's a way to assault seawalls with a wave of men. So imagine a scaling ladder, but on a large scale. Now, this at first starts to go well, because this is a large, intimidating structure. It comes up pretty suddenly. It's still dark, so this thing would kind of just appear in the gloom. And then a bunch of guys are running up it all at once, screaming. Perhaps the Rhodians were not in the best position to defend that spot, so they're starting to panic. But then they notice creaking. And they notice that this thing's starting to collapse under the weight of the attackers. They start to cheer. And at the same time, it caught on fire. So the sambuca catches on fire, and Rhodians later claimed that they saw the goddess Isis appear and shoot fire at this structure. Most likely, however, it was a Rhodian ballista or catapult on the walls that shot a flaming projectile that caught this thing on fire. And so, with the sambuca taken out, Mithridates found that he had no other siege equipment at hand, because usually siege equipment was assembled on the spot, and because the Pontic army was not as well supplied as, say, Alexander's force, which had its own siege train, or a Roman army, which typically had a siege train, he most likely only had that piece of equipment and nothing else. Not only that, but all of the panic that the Rhodians had been feeling before was gone now. Their confidence was restored by this victory. And so Mithridates decided to bypass Rhodes and go on to take targets of opportunity. His momentum in general was still holding. So he actually goes all the way to Athens, and the Athenians will throw open the gates to him and welcome him in. He'll address the assembly. So this is not necessarily a turning point in the war, but it is important because this does mean that there is still an island holding out for the Romans, and the Rhodians, while they're not a major power, they still have a fleet, and they are still capable, at least in small-scale actions. So this was a definite victory that was much needed, and it also is a victory which owes in part at least to Lucius Cassius, who stood by the Rhodians while this happened. Now exactly how responsible he and his men were for this is hard to say, but one assumes they must have done something. As for Cheiremen, for whatever reason, he decided to take refuge in the temple of Artemis at Ephesus rather than go with Cassius and his sons to Rhodes. So Cassius and The two sons of Cheiremen will survive because they went to Rhodes and were part of that victory. As for Cheiremen, however, he actually will stay behind. Why does he do that? Most likely to try to rally support locally and watch events there. In theory, he should have been safe doing this, because based on the laws of war and supplication, anyone who goes to a temple of the gods for refuge should not be disturbed. So it would be a crime against the gods to remove someone from a sanctuary or to harm them in the sanctuary. However, Mithridates was not willing to play by the rules, and through his actions he made Cheiremen into something of a martyr. So what he determined is that he needed to forge a strong bond with all of the non-Romans of Asia and make them all guilty of something. So not only were many of them willing to join him voluntarily, but there were some who were holding out, as witnessed by the actions of Cheiremen. And so in order to make the rest come to his cause and then be stuck with him, he decided to pull off a general massacre of Romans, Italians, and collaborators in 88 and make as many people complicit as possible. So, doing that, Mithridates broke a whole lot of violations of religious norms. There were a number of other people, Romans, Italians, and collaborators, who were killed the same way Cheiremen was, by being yanked out of temples. So it was a fairly common thing for Romans to go to temples when they realized what Mithridates was planning. That, of course, did not save any of them. A number of them also escaped through other means, such as the famous Rutilius Rufus, an exiled ex-governor, who actually got exiled for being not rapacious enough as governor of Asia. Anyway, he retained local popularity, and so the locals convinced him to dress up like a Greek, and then probably vouched for him that he was just some local guy. So he survives all of this, but most Romans, Italians, and collaborators were killed. As for the total number, the number offered in our sources is 100,000. Most likely that number is way too high, but again, it's a nice round number, and it does give us a very vivid impression of the idea that by the time Mithridates was done, the Roman presence had been wiped out. And also, this means that he had effectively bound the non-Romans to himself, because any option of being with the Romans or a friend of the Romans had been literally removed. And you could guarantee that the Romans would be seeking blood when they came back in force. So your choices now were to work with Mithridates and hope to avoid Rome's wrath, or face Rome's wrath anyway. So politically, this was actually an astute, if brutal, move by Mithridates, and a lot of that is set up by Cheiremen and men like him. As for Lucius Cassius, by saving the sons of Cheiremen, he ensured that later on the house of Cheiremen would continue and that they would remain faithful and resilient allies of the Romans in this area, where clearly the Romans would need strong local support. So Lucius Cassius once again will do a small but still notable deed. After being a part of the successful stand at Rhodes, Lucius Cassius fades from history. We don't know how much longer he lived, or if he remained in good standing at Rome. Most likely, if he made it back to Rome, he remained in good standing in the Senate, even if he was far from being a hero. His conduct, while not terribly impressive overall, was not shameful. He clearly didn't make as much of an ass of himself as someone like Manius Aquillius. He probably was not as corrupt, and he did manage to make some local friends. You'll notice that Nicomedes IV would rather be with Cassius than with Aquillius. You also will take note that Cheiremen and his sons were willing to place their fate and the fate of their family in the hands of Cassius, whereas we hear of no similar offers being made to Manius Aquillius. So, in all likelihood, Lucius Cassius did remain in good standing, even if his war record was not one to brag about. Now, in terms of the significance of that stand itself, it was not quite a momentum breaker. Mithridates was still able to make it over to Greece and capture Athens, among other places, but had he overrun Rhodes, it would have been a great military success. It would have shown the vitality of his forces, and it would have created more panic in the Greek world. The fact that he failed at Rhodes and gave up so easily perhaps made some of the Greeks think, okay, this Mithridates guy, while talented, is a flash in the pan. The Romans are very methodical and determined. They would never have allowed something like that to happen. They would have doggedly continued until they won. And so we had better remain loyal, because the Romans are actually a more fearsome enemy, and when they eventually get their stuff together in Italy and come back, they will be angry with everyone who has defected. And that ended up being what happened, of course. So the First Mithridatic War has two phases, and of the commanders of the first phase, there's no doubt Lucius Cassius was the best of them, and that's not a very high bar. However, his one victory of sorts and his show to the people of Asia that not all Romans were necessarily corrupt, incompetent, and vicious was important, and that will help set the stage for the second part of the war, where Sulla will arrive and free the Roman territory. By the way, even Sulla's performance will be compromised by the fact that his eyes are back on Italy, where he wants to fight another round of civil war. So even he will only do the least to expel Mithridates, but not eliminate the threat once and for all. So in that sense, Lucius Cassius is, in some ways, a harbinger of things to come, of Roman commanders who will suffer unnecessarily because of the bad decisions of others. So not only does he suffer due to Manius Aquillius, but then the cause that he suffered so much for will be something that other people have to suffer for later, because Sulla does not pursue the war to its logical conclusion. So Lucius Cassius, in many ways, was a prisoner of fortune. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and also, if you ever have the opportunity to do it, probably don't mess with Mithridates, and don't stick around if you think he's going to massacre your people.